Imagine walking into a market 5,000 years ago with nothing in your pocket. No dollars, no coins, no cash, no credit card. You want food, but the seller still expects something in return. So what do you give them? A bag of grain? A goat? A piece of silver? Or maybe a promise? Because here's the strange part. Humans were already finding ways to buy, sell, borrow, and trade long before the first coins existed. So if coins weren't the first money, what was? And how did humans convince each other that one object could be worth another? The answer begins with a problem that sounds simple, but could make an entire economy painfully complicated. Imagine you have meat, but you need grain. You find someone with grain, but they don't want meat. They want a tool. The toolmaker doesn't want meat either. He wants a goat. Suddenly, your simple trade has become a chain of 4 people, and every person has to want exactly what someone else has. Economists call this the double coincidence of wants. But ancient humans didn't have economics textbooks explaining the problem. They simply experienced it, and eventually, they started looking for a better solution. At first, people could rely heavily on relationships. In a small community, you knew who had food, who had animals, who could make tools, and who owed favors. You might help someone today, knowing they would help you later. But what happens when the village becomes a town? What happens when hundreds or thousands of strangers begin trading with each other? You can't remember every favor. You can't personally trust everyone. And you definitely can't carry everything you own to every market. Humans needed something that could make value easier to measure and easier to exchange. But here's the twist. The first solution may not have been an object at all. It may have been a promise. If your neighbor gave you grain today, you could owe them something after the harvest. If a worker performed a task, they could receive a recorded ration. If a farmer borrowed seed, the debt could be settled later. Suddenly, humans weren't just exchanging objects, they were keeping track of obligations. And that tiny change would eventually help create something much bigger than barter, the idea of money. Think about the power of a promise. You give someone food today, and they promise to return something later. But how do you remember the exact amount? What if they deny it? What if you forget? What if the person moves away? Once communities became larger, memory alone wasn't enough. And this is where one of humanity's greatest inventions enters the story: writing. Long before humans were writing novels or recording famous speeches, ancient scribes were recording economic information. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets documented things like grain distributions, workers' rations, livestock, and other goods. Why would anyone spend so much effort recording something as ordinary as grain? Because once you can record an obligation, you can manage it. You can compare it. You can check it later. A tiny mark in clay could essentially say, "This person received this much." And suddenly, an economic relationship no longer depended entirely on human memory. But here's the question. If a clay tablet can record value, does that make the tablet money? Not necessarily. The record is evidence of value, not necessarily the value itself. And humans still needed something that could move easily between people. So what could work? One obvious answer was something everyone already needed: food. Grain was measurable, divisible, storable, and useful to almost everyone in an agricultural society. If you had a certain amount of grain, you had something that other people wanted. But grain had a problem. Imagine trying to buy a small tool by carrying a giant sack of wheat across town. It works, but it's not exactly convenient. And grain can spoil, attract pests, and take up space. Livestock had another problem. A cow could be extremely valuable, but what if you only needed something worth a tiny fraction of a cow? You couldn't exactly cut the animal into convenient payment sizes. So humans started looking for things that were durable, measurable, portable, and widely accepted. And this is where the story starts getting really interesting. Because once humans began thinking about value in this way, they discovered that something didn't necessarily have to be useful to you personally. It just had to be something you believed someone else would accept later. And that changes everything. Imagine someone hands you a small piece of silver. You can't eat it, you can't plant it, You can't use it to build a house. So why would you accept it? Because you expect another person to accept it from you later. That's the secret behind money. The object itself doesn't have to satisfy your needs. It has to represent something other people recognize as valuable. In ancient Mesopotamia and other parts of the ancient Near East, silver became important in economic systems and was often measured by weight. That was a major step because metal didn't spoil like grain and it could be divided into smaller amounts. But there was still a problem. How do you know that the piece of silver you're receiving is actually worth what the other person claims? You need a scale. You need to check the weight. You may need to check the purity. Every transaction becomes a tiny investigation. And if you're trading with a stranger, how much do you trust their measurement? This sounds like a small inconvenience, but imagine an entire economy working this way. Every major transaction could require weighing and verifying metal. And silver wasn't the only thing humans experimented with. In different societies, objects such as shells, beads, livestock, grain, and other commodities could play important monetary or exchange roles. Cowrie shells, for example, were used as money in various societies over long periods because they were durable, portable, recognizable, and difficult to produce in unlimited quantities in many places. But here's something important. A shell wasn't automatically money just because it was a shell. If people didn't accept it as valuable, it was just a shell. That's the deeper story. Money is partly a social agreement. If everyone believes something can be exchanged for goods and services, that belief gives the object economic power. But now imagine you're an ancient ruler watching all of this. You see people weighing silver, checking metal, exchanging goods, recording debts, and arguing over value. Wouldn't there be a way to make the entire process simpler? What if you could take a piece of metal, standardize its weight, and put an official mark on it? What if one symbol could tell everyone, "You don't need to weigh this yourself. This has already been verified"? That's the problem that coins were about to solve. Around the 7th century BCE, in the ancient kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia, standardized coinage began appearing in a form that would transform commerce. Some of the earliest coins were made from electrum, a natural mixture of gold and silver. They carried official designs that helped identify their origin and value. But here's the part most people miss. The coin didn't invent money. Humans had already been measuring value, recording debts, using commodities, weighing silver, and trusting objects as stores of value for centuries. The coin simply packaged several useful features together. It was portable, it was standardized, it was recognizable, and most importantly, it was backed by an authority people recognized. That's why the appearance of coins was such a powerful moment. It allowed money to become increasingly independent from direct usefulness. You didn't need to want the metal itself. You only needed to know that other people wanted the coin. And that idea would eventually take humans somewhere even stranger. Paper money could represent value without containing valuable metal. Banknotes could represent promises. Modern currency could have value because governments and economies support it. And today, most of the money people use isn't even physical. It's numbers inside bank databases. So think about that for a second. If modern money can exist as numbers on a screen, and ancient money could exist as a promise recorded in clay, was money ever really about the object at all? So what was the first money? Was it grain? Was it cattle? Was it silver? Was it a shell? Or was it simply a promise that everyone agreed to recognize? The truth is that there probably wasn't one single object that deserves the title of first money. Different human societies developed different systems because they faced different problems. Some relied heavily on commodities. Some used accounting systems and debt. Some measured precious metals. Some used shells or other durable objects. What connected all of these systems wasn't the physical material. It was the idea behind them. Value could be represented, measured, transferred, and trusted. Once humans understood that, the possibilities became almost unlimited. A piece of silver could represent purchasing power. A coin could represent a standardized amount of metal. A paper note could represent a claim. And eventually, a digital number could represent money without anyone ever touching the physical thing behind it. The further money evolved, the less it looked like a physical object, and the more it looked like information. And maybe that's the strangest part of the entire story. When you tap your phone to pay for something today, nothing physical has to move from your hand to the seller. A number changes on a screen, someone's balance goes down, someone else's balance goes up, and millions of people accept that change because they trust the system behind it. Thousands of years ago, an ancient scribe could press a mark into clay to record grain or an obligation. Today, computers record transactions in databases around the world. The technology is almost unimaginably different, but the basic human idea is surprisingly similar. Record value, trust the system, and expect someone else to recognize it. So the first money wasn't necessarily a coin. It may have been grain, silver, livestock, shells, credit, or even a promise. Coins didn't invent money. They simply gave an old human idea a standardized shape, because in the end, money was never really about the thing you could hold in your hand. Money was about trust. And the moment humans learned that other people could trust the same symbol, object, or promise, money was born.